What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, the first Planet of the Apes movie in 7 years. I cannot believe it's been that long since War for the Planet of the Apes. And my initial kind of spoiler-free comments would be, it has an incredibly strong opening. And then over time, it kind of slowly but surely fizzles down to like a pretty good science fiction movie. And the movie's a little overly long, 2 hours and 25 minutes. But I think as far as a return for a franchise is concerned, it was pretty goddamn good, and I went into this movie in the most foul mood imaginable. I went to see this movie in IMAX at the AMC Theater at 34th Street and 8th Avenue, and right before the movie started, I started noticing mice scurrying around on the floor. I was like, well, that's not a good sign, but at least it's not as bad as the bed bugs at the AMC up at 42nd. Then there was a row of, they're not kids and they weren't adults, they were somewhere in between, just fresh-faced youths who were just on their worst behavior, and they kept throwing candy in all different directions. I guess they were throwing away the pieces that they didn't want to eat. It was like, this is why we have mice scurrying around the floor, and then they were picking fights with people in the crowd. I mean, I was prepared to just have the most miserable evening imaginable, but as the movie started, and even though I was kind of like, with my arms crossed and my lips stuck out, like ready to like take it all my anger and frustration on the movie because I was angry at the crowd and the conditions of the theater, but I noticed something funny happening about a couple minutes in. I was like, wait a second. Is this secretly really good? Because I found it to be epic and stirring. Like, the opening of this movie takes place 300 years after or roughly 300 years after the events of the last movie. And so humans have basically been kind of running to the ground, living like cavemen, while the apes are more or less living in like a harmonious state with the rest of nature. And this tribe, or this village that our main character comes from, Noah, they have this incredibly cool culture where they're a culture of climbers and they're a culture of eagle trainers, where basically within their culture they have like a rite of passage where they climb up to these lofty heights to steal eggs from nests. They bring them down and they raise them, and those eagles then help them like fishing and things like that. But it's a really cool environment that where you're kind of thrust back into this world. And I was like, you know what? This is actually really interesting science fiction. Like, to what degree would the apes change and evolve over several centuries after the memory of Caesar and all of his teachings? Ape, together strong, ape must never kill ape, all those mottos that he had back in the first three movies. But I found myself completely getting sucked in, and what was really helping is some of the apes, not all of them, have some of the best expressive eyes that I've seen in CGI in a long time. And some of them, you can always tell something's funky when like light is landing on an ape and it doesn't quite interact with the fur or reflect on their eyes in the right way. But with some of them, I was like, Jesus Christ, like the way the sun's interacting with the fur and the wind's going through. And then they would move in for these close-ups and the faces. They were so emotional and allowed the actors to have such emotional range. I was like, oh my God, is this going to end up being one of the really good Planet of the Apes movies? And for those people who like to keep track of these things, this is actually the 10th feature film called Planet of the Apes. We had the original 5, or as the great Kevin Marr likes to say, the 5 fingers of the fist. And everybody likes to kind of debate which of those movies are their favorites. I liked the first one quite a bit, and the fourth. The first one really fucked me up as a kid. I saw it on TV, censored with my family as a little boy, and it was still absolutely terrifying. I think I learned about lobotomies through that movie, and I was like, age 5, like, don't give me a lobotomy, but
you did it. You cut up his brain, you bloody baboon!
Anyway, I think the first movie from 1968 has aged incredibly well. And then, of course, we had the Tim Burton reboot, I think in around 2001. And then we had the Rise, Dawn, War trilogy, 2 of which were directed by Matt Reeves. But for this movie, we have Wes Ball, and this was my first time seeing one of his movies. I never saw any of his, what the hell are those movies called? I keep wanting to say Maze Runner. He did the Maze Runner franchise, and for whatever reason, those movies never grabbed me. They always seemed like kind of young adult fiction, like channeled into movies, and I was like, you know what? I'm just too goddamn old to be watching movies that are primarily concerned with, teen characters, or at least what appeared to be teen characters to my eyes. And who knows? Maybe I was a huge dick to disregard the Maze Runner franchise in that fashion. But long story short, Wes Ball, he's got my attention now. I don't think he's on the level of Matt Reeves, but I would argue the first third of this movie I liked more than the 2 Matt Reeves Planet of the Apes movies, just because the world was so fully realized and so compelling. And the acting was so incredible. But where this movie starts to fade, or where it starts to kind of slip down to just pretty good territory, is when they start interacting with the human characters. And I think it's one of the great ironies of the modern age, where we have technology that can so vividly bring the apes to life and allow so many actors to kind of imbue them with so much personality, and yet through casting or through writing, they can't manage to come up with a few interesting human characters. And like the human characters in this movie, so there's May, played by Freya Allen, who's kind of the main central protagonist through which we kind of get to experience the story once she shows up. And we also have William H. Macy, who back in the 90s was the king of indie film. I mean, seeing him in things like Fargo or Boogie Nights, I mean, he instantly achieved legendary status. But it's amazing how the writers basically just decided to take a day off. The writers are Josh Friedman, Rick Jaffa, and Amanda Silver. But it seems like they made zero effort of any kind to imbue any of the human characters with any actual lifelike qualities. And they're trying to make the character of May mysterious, where you don't quite know what her agenda is, what her goals are. All we know is that she's smarter than most humans, and they never really explain why. And that's also one of the big flaws of this movie, is that we've had a 7-year break since the last movie, and we get a little title card giving us the backdrop. But for me, and maybe this is kind of spoiler light or spoiler adjacent, but there's a discrepancy between, or not a discrepancy, but basically some humans are very, very bright and living in these little communities, and some humans are basically living in rags and like drinking out of creeks and like looking under rocks for worms to eat and that sort of thing. And they never really give a satisfying explanation as to why. Maybe that explanation was provided in War back in 2017 when Woody Harrelson starts losing his ability to speak. But honestly, I don't recall because I haven't watched that movie in 7 years. But this movie did not give a satisfactory answer on that front. But getting back to the main drama at hand, you have this new kingdom that's emerging under the leadership of Proximus Caesar. And Kevin Durand, oh my God, he just goes for it. And I knew when I saw the first teaser like 6 months ago, when I heard him say like, "What a wonderful day."
What a wonderful day!
All right, whoever's doing the voice acting for that character, they are holding nothing back. And it makes the villain of the movie so much more charismatic and so much more compelling and so much more interesting, because he's a villain where his goals and his aspirations, you can kind of sort of see everything from his point of view. What he wants is for apes to remain strong. He never wants them to go back to cages like they were a few hundred years prior. But he's willing to resort to pretty horrendous tactics to achieve his goals, like attacking other villages and enslaving other apes. Ape must never kill ape, and he's obviously not following that rule. But the team of heroes that's trying to stop him, we have Noah, played by Owen Teague, and he's a pretty good central character. Not as interesting as Caesar was in the first few movies, but pretty good. But the real show stealer in this movie is Peter Macon as Raka. He's so goddamn good that he makes everybody else seem terrible, especially the character of May. And I was like, every time he speaks, you just, like, May comes across like she has the personality of like the world's most uninteresting roof shingle. It's like, oh my God, like drink a cup of coffee, do whatever you got to do, but you got to wake up and give your role some vitality, or bring in somebody else who's a little bit, more excitable and going to approach this with a little bit more energy. Because Peter Macon, I mean, he deserves a Special Achievement Academy Award. He's so charismatic and so hilarious and so goddamn funny. And I feel like when it comes to the special effects, if you look at his eyes and his fur, it is some of the best special effects I've seen in recent memory.
That is not everything.
But the main central tension within Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes is this ancient military facility or government facility. We're not quite sure what kind of facility it was. All we know is that it's got these two huge giant iron doors that are sealed shut, and the Proximus Caesar character is doing everything in his power try to get those doors open, but his technology is a little primitive. His technology basically consists of a lot of apes with like vines and ropes pulling on it and hoping it'll open. So yeah, the chances of him getting it open at some point are slim to none. But what he thinks is inside are tools of mankind from a couple hundred years ago that will allow him to continue to evolve or extend his life. He knows there'll be some major assets or some major advantages to be had if he can unlock all the secrets within. And then you have the character whose name I keep forgetting because she's so boring, but the character of May, where all we know is that she doesn't want him to get in there, but we're not quite sure what she wants to find inside that. But she slowly but surely convinces Noah to help her stop Proximus Caesar. And so the battle is on for the future of this little colony or this little kingdom. And we can tell it's somewhere in Southern California because at one point they're going by an airport, and it's got this very recognizable building that's in the center of LAX. And I lived in LA for 7 years. So as soon as I saw that building, I was like, oh, this is an LA-based story. And I think the greatest success of this movie is that it manages to be a standalone Apes movie, and it tees up the next one if they get the chance to do so. And my theater was more or less full, so I imagine they will get a chance to do another one if this movie does pretty well. This is a movie that was made by 20th Century Fox or 20th Century Studios, which is now part of Disney, but this is one of Disney's big movies this summer. And obviously, if they see even like a hint of life in an intellectual property, well, then they will just, beat it. Like, they will run that horse or beat that horse until they've gotten every last mile out of the animal that they possibly can. But I do think there's a chance that this movie will spawn a few sequels, but my hope is that they will eliminate a few of the more boring characters. But all the original Apes movies, the 5 Apes movies, they all were almost kind of in different genres or telling different stories. Like, the second one felt a lot like the first, but the third is totally its own thing. I mean, you basically have apes in like modern day society teeing up what comes in the fourth one. And the fourth one is the most apocalyptic and the darkest, and it's definitely, I think, dramatically one of the most satisfying. And the fifth is pretty cool, but what I like is how, depending upon what kind of science fiction you're into, going back to what Kevin Marr said, they're the 5 fingers of the fist. You're going to love one of those fingers. And I guess when it comes to style and music and acting, you really can't beat the original. I mean, Charlton Heston, he just goes for it. But that kind of kingly dramatic gravitas that Charlton Heston possessed in the first one, I would argue, in his own way or in a different way, Peter Macon brings to the table as Rocca in this. I mean, every time he spoke, I was either smiling or laughing or just delighted, because he is a true disciple and a true historian of Caesar from the first 3 movies. He's obsessed with history, he's obsessed with books and ideas, and I just found myself being very drawn to his character. And it's interesting seeing how, without getting too heavy-handed, the movie does have different kind of not political points of view or like world views or just philosophies that are always kind of wrestling with each other. But not to worry, if your thing is watching apes and orangutans and gorillas riding horses and throwing nets on humans, I mean, that's kind of like one of the most signature images you can think of, or signature moments you can think of from the original, where you hear the horns, you see the horses, like, wait a second, the whole world's gone upside down, apes riding horses, what's going on here? So if what you're looking for is a little bit of the familiar from the past Apes movies, it does provide that. But I did find it really interesting seeing this new clan that's really good at climbing and really good at dealing with eagles. They just have unique skills that can be applied strategically for some sort of advantage, but they're not warlike, they're not violent. They're tough and they're very resilient. But I thought that was interesting, and so I do think this movie manages to stand on its own apart from the rest of the Planet of the Apes movies. I still think the worst of all 10 that have been made so far, it's got to be the Tim Burton one. I thought the Tim Burton one was horrendous. I mean, just fucking horrible, and had one of the dumbest endings in movies of that time. And I very rarely hear anybody defending Tim Burton's Planet of the Apes. And that was one of the movies where I realized, oh, like Tim Burton is turning into a goddamn hack. Like, he was one of my favorite childhood directors. And then by 2001, he was not remotely one of my favorite directors. But how would I compare this movie to the rest? There's Rise, Dawn, and War. Maybe Dawn is the best of the modern crop in terms of this continuity. I haven't revisited it in a couple of years. Not since I did my podcast, Wrong Reel 284, which I'll link down below. But I had John Cribbs and Bill Scurry and Kevin Marr, and we talked about the original films and made some predictions about what was about to come out at that time. And we just had an absolute blast. But I feel like Dawn of the Planet of the Apes really successfully captured just a world gone mad, a dystopian hellhole where people are dying by diseases and the apes are on the ascent and that sort of thing. It was a really good, solid science fiction movie for that time. But getting back to Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, I have 2 big complaints about the ending, and they are definitely spoiler light. So if you don't want any spoilers before you see the movie over the course of this weekend, bail out now. But here are my 2 big grievances. So you've got this giant battle taking place in this facility where some of it's underground, some of it's way above ground. It's basically inside like this giant cliff that's on the beach. And there's a wall keeping the ocean at bay. And the ocean's like right there at like the top of the wall. I mean, if there's like a little bit of a breeze, that water's coming in, but they're basically acting like if the ocean ever gets in, it's going to destroy this facility. But here's the thing with like water, like with like a water table, if you were to remove the wall, the ocean would come in, but it's not like the ocean is going to suddenly rise like 200 feet. It would just go in and then fill it and then kind of settle. But there's this big giant battle at the end of this facility as the water's coming in. The water just keeps rising. I'm like, it won't rise above the level of sea level outside. That's just, that will never happen unless you have, like floors rising, like bringing the water up. But they were trying to give this feeling of dramatic intensity as everybody's like kind of running and fighting and escaping, and the water keeps coming. I get what they were going for, but I just kept calling bullshit, because if you have even like the most basic knowledge of like, physics from taking a bath, you will understand like how water eventually kind of levels out. But another frustration I had was with the revelation at the end. And obviously, nobody's ever going to be able to match the revelation of the first Planet of the Apes. Charlton Heston on the beach, smacking his fist into the sand, looking at the Statue of Liberty, where I remember when I saw it for the first time, I knew enough about the world to know that was the Statue of Liberty, and that this world was a different world from what I thought it was. Like, it's so hard to think back to like how was I processing Planet of the Apes? I think I was like 5 or 6 when I first saw it, but I realized, oh my God, this has been Planet Earth all the time, and he hasn't known it, but now I know it, and oh my God, what a great ending. And every once in a while, one of the Planet of the Apes movies will try to have a really cool, big, like explosive revelation at the end that changes the way you look at everything else. And I was feeling a lot of frustration during the climax. Like, what is this chick up to? What is she trying to achieve? Why did she come here? Like, why is she trying so hard to just keep like a few simple guns out of the ape's hand? Because their knowledge of science is not sufficient enough where they could actually unlock the potential of all the technology within. They might throw a few hand grenades or shoot a few guns, but otherwise, like, who cares? And then we finally see at the end that she's basically there looking for this like this decryptor, this decryption module where she can slot it back in with all these satellites in another part of California, which will allow the humans in that little area to communicate with other humans. But once again, I was absolutely infuriated because she shows up at this facility and like they're wearing like hazmat suits to like, or basically they're trying to keep like the virus from getting access to them. But she's totally fine. So I'm like, this is the time where you explain why she's different from the rest of humans and why she's not affected by the virus or why they're still taking these precautions. But I feel like the storytelling got more lazy and the world building got a little more sloppy. And once again, the human characters in this movie, they're so devoid of any personality traits of any kind. It's impossible to root for them. So yeah, I'll gladly root for the villains moving forward if we're going to get more of the same. Yeah, I found the ending to be a bit of a letdown. And it's a shame because it starts off so strong and it's so good and so compelling. And I do think if a movie's strong enough at the opening, well, then a lot of people will either forgive or forget or just deliberately fail to notice as a movie is kind of sliding into oblivion. And this movie doesn't really slide all the way into oblivion, but it definitely starts inching its way towards mediocrity. So I just hope that whoever was shooting and editing and designing and putting together the opening of this film, they're given more power, more input, more creative control moving forward because they know how to do great sci-fi. In any case, I do not know what the tracking is for this movie going into the weekend. I don't know how well it's supposed to do or what would be considered a win for Fox and for Disney, but I'll be very curious to see what kind of box office it generates. I'll be watching the headlines eagerly over the weekend to see what kind of audience is still there, and also just what kind of word of mouth this movie might generate, because I would never say that I'm like a giant Planet of the Apes freak. I mean, I don't own any of the movies on Blu-ray. I've seen all the original movies a couple times each. The first one probably the most. And I've seen all the recent movies, I think, twice each. But I don't sit around thinking, like, when are we going to get more Planet of the Apes? If the franchise went away for good, like, my life would not be, I would not feel any poorer as a result. But I know there's some people out there that all they think about is these goddamn Planet of the Apes movies. So I look forward to seeing what they have to say. And also, I just look forward to seeing what all the casuals and the normies have to say, because I feel like all those kids in my row that were behind me, I'm calling them kids, but they were late teens or early 20s. Anyway, obnoxious, rude, stupid, loud, which places them somewhere between like age 15 and 23. But if they were having, because they did get quiet over time as the movie progressed, if they were having a good time, well, then that might bode well for this movie's prospects. But on that note, I'm going to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. But I hope everybody has a great weekend at the movies. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.